News 6. Hello, I'm Reba McIntyre, and I'm coming to you straight from Chinatown. We've got a special edition of News 6 today. We're going to go in depth of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Here with me today is my good friend Deborah, and she's going to tell us a little bit about this legislation.
The Rehabilitation Act was created to try and normalize treatment for people with diagnosed disabilities in the United States. People who have been diagnosed were suffering from stigmas and generalizations about their work ethic and how little they would be able to contribute. Vocational settings were also insensitive to any physical barriers that would be preventing individuals from fulfilling their duties. This act is requiring affirmative action by employers with federal contracts to hire mentally and physically disabled workers, assuming that they are making reasonable accommodations for these people to be able to work.
Thanks for that intriguing information, Deborah. Now that we know a little bit about the Rehabilitation Act, let's learn about its history. And yes, what did change buildings?
From 1960 to 1975, parents and teachers were noticing and becoming more and more familiar with the concept of students with educational learning disabilities and troubles. Organizations were created advocating for children with disabilities, and officials began to take notice of all the rising public concern for children with disabilities and the opportunities that were being denied.
Well, aren't you just smart, Deborah? What explanations now, either, longitudinal, environmental, categorical systems, contemporary and emerging, for the atypical or within the scope of this law?
Well, that's a great question, Reba. There are environmental conditions that must be present in order to confer with membership as being acknowledged as being disabled. And the legislation actually demands that vocational environments are free of physical barriers that would be a disablement and prevent individuals from being able to work. There also is a need for a categorical legitimacy, meaning that value judgments are made to decipher who actually qualifies as being disabled. So in order to even be included in the mandated affirmative action, individuals must have gotten a medical diagnosis stating that they were in fact disabled. Without this label, employers would not know what reasonable accommodations.
Well, isn't that wonderful? Now I've got another question for you. Are the principles that guide the policy in line with accommodation, universal, or junctured approaches to disability?
The principles that guide these policies are of ethical concern in the sense that the legislation is not blatantly calling for universal changes across the United States. It's not saying that all vocational settings need to incorporate this, and that, and the vagueness of what accommodations need to be made and to what extent is really unclear. The question of who cannot be hired merely because they are unqualified for the job is blurry and leaves room for prejudices within employment.
Now, can you tell me what universal changes there are, if any?
Well, universal changes...
alright, continue, sorry.
Universal changes would help those who may be disabled but do not have a diagnosis. The Rehabilitation Act is having employers practice affirmative action to hire mentally and physically disabled people who qualify for it, meaning that they need to have known disablement. So I think having universal changes or regulations would help those who are unable to get a medical diagnosis.
Isn't that very interesting? That's my face. Now, let's get back to the street. Now that we're together at the same place, I've got one last question for you. How do you anticipate that this legislation will affect you in your professional or personal activity?
Well, that's a good question, Reba. This could affect professional and personal activity in the sense that if we were to be an administrator who's in charge of hiring people, we'd have to take certain things into consideration. The Rehabilitation Act advocates for the rights of people with disabilities and their right to be hired for a job if they are just as qualified as someone else. It also claims that training opportunities are required to be available. It could affect us personally if we were the ones being disabled or injured and we were left with impairments in which we may need to advocate for ourselves in the workforce.
After this extensive interview with Deborah, I hope that you all have learned quite a bit about the Rehabilitation Act. Now, I sat down with her for a little bit afterwards and she told me the progress that has occurred over the years. And according to the International Center for the Disabled, about 6 million of the nation's 18.5 million people that are considered to be in their working years are disabled and have jobs. With that said, workers with disabilities still feel as if there's little room for social mobility and that they are being discriminated against. Granted that this article is a little dated, we like to think conditions have improved. Now that's all for our Channel 6 news broadcast. Thank you for joining me. I'm Reba McIntyre coming to you from Chinatown. This project was done by
Kristen Hopkins.
Chelsea Barrett,
Nicole DeAndrea.